Hello, this is the Ipswich Vineyard Core Community study on the Gospel of John, and this is like a summary of our discussion on John 16. So what we were looking at is over the last few weeks we've been doing a chapter a week, and Jesus has often said things about followers will do greater works than these. So for example, in John 14:12 to 14, it says, "Very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father, and I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it. If you remain in me, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples." And that's John 15:7 and 8. John 15:16 and 17 says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you, so that you might go and bear fruit, fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command, love each other." And then in this chapter 16, verses 23 and 24, it says, "In that day you will no longer ask me anything. Very truly I tell you, my Father will give you whatever you ask in my name. Until now you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask and you will receive, and your joy will be complete." So we looked at different ways of understanding this promise about doing greater things, and whatever you ask, it will happen. It could be that Jesus is just referring to the disciples. So we know in the stories in Acts that the disciples certainly did miraculous deeds. They escaped from prison, they healed people, they raised the dead. So it may be Jesus was just referring to the disciples who were with him on that particular occasion. Or it might be referring to all of Jesus's disciples, but you need enough faith to make it happen. It says in James that a double, what's it called? Something like a double sided man gets nothing, or something. It's basically, if you've got any doubt, then your prayers won't be answered. It sounds like the sort of implication of what's being said in James. So it might be that the promise is there, but we don't see as many miracles as we could, because as followers we don't have enough faith to produce the miracles. But then what we wanted to explore in a more positive way was actually whether it isn't about individuals after all, but it's about the whole nature of the change from Jesus to the church, and what it means for the Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of God, to be poured out onto the community of believers, the ecclesia, the assembly of believers. And if you look at it in that way, it makes much more sense to say, well, the church as a whole can do a lot more than Jesus as an individual was doing. I mean, Jesus, healed as many people as he healed, but through the work of hospitals and medical care over the centuries, the Christian church must have healed millions of people. Jesus, was able to teach individual people who came to him, but through church structures, through schools and education, the church has been able to educate many more people than Jesus did. So simply by the fact that it's the church is an organization composed of millions of people, that is obviously going to be able to do more in that sense than Jesus did. But then the question becomes, well, what is the purpose of the church, and what should the church be doing? And what we then looked at was this sort of idea about the role of the church and what is the church for. For many years, the Christians believed that the church, the purpose of the church, was to establish the kingdom of God on earth. This kind of changed around maybe 200 years ago. So for the first, nearly 2,000 years, the church held something like the following. It's called Post-Millenialism. Millennium was this sort of there's a reference in Revelation, I think it is, to this sort of 1,000-year reign of Christ. And so the question is, well, when is this going to occur? And for much of Christianity, the idea was that the church would work to establish the kingdom of God on earth, and when it was successful and triumphant, then Jesus would return, and so that the second coming would come at the end of this extended period of Christian rule of the earth. So I'll quote to you from Wikipedia. It says, "Post-Millenialism holds that Jesus Christ establishes his kingdom on earth through his preaching and redemptive work in the first century, and that he equips his church with the gospel, empowers the church by the Spirit, and charges the church with the Great Commission in Matthew 28:19 to disciple all nations. Post-Millenialism expects that eventually the vast majority of people living will be saved. Increasing gospel success will gradually produce a time in history prior to Christ's return in which faith, righteousness, peace, and prosperity will prevail in the affairs of men and of nations. After an extensive era of such conditions, Jesus Christ will return visibly, bodily, and gloriously to end history with the general resurrection and the final judgment, after which the eternal order follows." So it says that this was the dominant theological belief for most of Christian history. However, around the sort of mid 1800s, and it didn't happen completely, but there's still Christians who would hold something like that today. But amongst evangelicals, I suppose, and then into Pentecostals, there was this idea that in fact it was the other way round, that Christ's second coming would be imminent, and it wouldn't follow a period of Christian success, but rather it's a bit like the sort of story of Noah, where things get really bad and then God just kind of comes in and ends it, even though of course God actually says he's never going to do that again at the end of the flood. But nevertheless, that tends to be quite a widespread view amongst evangelicals and Pentecostals, that that the church won't be like incredibly successful and take over everything, but rather there's going to be like a period of struggle that goes on between the forces of evil and the forces of good, and then Christ will return to kind of resolve that struggle on the side of the good. There's various scenarios for an imminent second coming. They're usually defined in terms of when what's called the tribulation will happen. So the tribulation is a period of bad things happening to the earth and the people on the earth. Some hold, this is the post-tribulation theory, I think it's called, that the Christians will be on the earth during the time of this tribulation. So we're likely to see things getting worse and worse, and then Jesus returns. On the other hand, the pre-tribulation theory is also what's known as the rapture, is that all Christians are taken up into heaven, and so they all leave the earth, and then this period of tribulation happens where everybody left behind, that's the name of a series of books that follow this idea, have bad things happen to them. So this idea of the church is obviously central to this eschatological idea. Eschatology is the doctrines of last things. So if you believe that the second coming is imminent, then you don't really think that the church is going to go out and be incredibly successful and convert loads of people, but rather you've kind of got a defensive position that the church is basically like an ark to try and keep people safe with all the bad things happening, and we're just kind of hanging in there until Jesus returns and sorts everything out. On the other hand, if you take the more traditional view that what was called the post-millennial view of the church being triumphant, then you think the job of the church is to go out and be victorious and convert loads of people, or if not convert loads of people, at least bring justice and peace and righteousness and prosperity and all that sort of thing to the earth. So since this idea of post-millennialism tends to be not so well known amongst evangelicals and Pentecostals, we wanted to spend a bit more time looking at that position. So one of the things we looked at was the year of Jubilee, which is an important notion in the Old Testament, that every 50 years, so the idea in Israel was that people would be given a certain amount of land, and you could sell your land, but you'd never ultimately give it to somebody else, because after 50 years everything would be reset. So it says in Leviticus 25, I think it is, basically if you sell a field, you're not really selling the field itself, you're just selling a certain number of years to use the field. So if this sort of Jubilee year was 10 years away, then if you sell the field to somebody, in effect you're selling them the field to borrow for 10 years, and then in the Jubilee year you would get it back again. And this sort of notion has been taken up by churches talking about writing off third world debt, that the Western countries actually causing more problems because of high interest payments that third world countries have, and if they just were able to cancel the debt, then developing countries would be able to kind of get out of the bad situations they're in, whereas at the moment they're tending to have to use any money they get to pay off loans. So it's basically an idea of justice, of restoration, of a way of avoiding people continuing in poverty. And there's another version of it, which was that if you sold yourself, if as a Hebrew you'd sold yourself, or sold some Hebrew was sold into service, that could only last for a maximum of 7 years, and that at the end of 7 years you would set free any Hebrews. So you couldn't be a slave or a servant for more than 7 years. So this again, the idea basically is that within the Old Testament they try to implement rules of sort of justice, of more equitable distribution of things, if you like. In James, in the New Testament book of James, chapter 5 verse 4, it says, "Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty." So the point of this is that there's a demand for righteousness here and now. There's a demand for justice in this lifetime. So insofar as the church should be promoting justice, promoting equality and fairness, and all of the things that were mentioned earlier on, peace, prosperity, and so on. There's a good record in the Bible of that being demanded now. It's not something that we've got to wait for God to come along and sort out. And in fact, to some extent, when Jesus comes, in the Gospels, people are saying, "Oh, you're going to sort out everything that's wrong," and it's not really, what his purpose was. But his purpose was, you could say, to create a church, to create a people that would be doing this. So this might be a better reading of these texts that say, when the Spirit comes and is poured out on the followers of Jesus, that they will do greater works. That what they're doing is they're promoting, as a church, we should be promoting peace, promoting prosperity, promoting justice, and that's part of the mission of the church. It isn't just about getting people to be saved and believe in Jesus and so on. Now, there is actually a movement, at least one movement, there may be others, within the evangelical Pentecostal church called the Seven Mountains. So if you Google Seven Mountains theology, you'll be able to come across arguments and statements of belief and so on. In fact, sometimes when you're watching like a worship concert or something like that, they might talk about discipling nations, and that's kind of a reference, I think sometimes anyway, to this Seven Mountains theology. So Seven Mountains is a reference to, in Revelation there's a beast with, there's seven mountains mentioned in Revelation, and built on, or the seven hills or the seven mountains in Revelation, the theology of this identifies seven aspects of society in which the church should be involved. So one is religion, which I guess is fair enough for the church. The family is number 2, education number 3, government number 4, media, the arts and entertainment industries is part of that, but also business, and then arts and entertainment actually gets a number 7. So basically the idea is of changing the kind of perspective of the church, the ecclesia, the people of God, to look at being more of an outward facing movement, an outward facing group of people who seek to change society for the better, to establish peace, prosperity, justice, and to get involved in all aspects. Often Christians are like, oh, I don't want to get in politics, I don't want to get involved in government, that sort of thing. But this movement is trying to change that. Now, I think they're actually, within the American context, very possibly aligning themselves more with republicanism, which I wouldn't agree with. But nevertheless, theologically, they're giving an argument for greater engagement with society and greater engagement with just promoting general good values such as peace, prosperity, justice, and so on. So I think it's worth mentioning, it's worth acknowledging that there are now movements within evangelical Pentecostal thought, which aren't just about like turning away from the world and not engaging with things that are happening in the world, but to just be waiting for the second coming, or see the world is, the sort of attitude, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through, that sort of attitude. They're definitely changing that, or they're challenging that sort of an attitude, and they're producing biblical justifications for why we should be more engaged in changing this world. And for my part, the environment would be obviously an important mountain, if you like, that we need to re-establish care for our environment and our planet and so on. And if you look in Revelation, there are indications in there of the church engaging with nations. So, for example, in Revelation 22:2, it's got about the tree of life, the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So that sounds like the church is involved at a time when nations still exist, and the church is trying to heal those nations. In Revelation 21:22-27, it talks about the city of God coming down to earth. Well, the city of God is a symbol for the church, and it talks about the nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. So this sounds like the church being a light, being a promoter of positive values, teaching nations justice, peace, prosperity, and the kings of the earth bringing their splendor into the church. Definitely sounds like engaging with nations, engaging with groups as a whole, rather than just trying to talk to individuals. We're trying to look at how we can do kingdom work on a more global basis, if you like, rather than just as individuals. There's also plenty of references in the New Testament to the restoration of things. So Acts 3:19 to 21, it says that heaven must receive Jesus until the times of the restoration of all things which God has spoken of. In Colossians 1:19 to 20, Paul, or the writer, writes about reconciling all things, that Christ will reconcile all things to himself. And in 2 Corinthians 5:17 to 19, it talks about all things have become new, all things are of God. In Luke 19:12 to 27, there's a parable of the talents, and the king in the parable sends these servants out to look after the vineyard, and he says, "Occupy till I come," and they have to look after and produce good things until the king returns. So it sounds a lot more of an active role that the church should be engaged in. And in fact, in Acts 17:6, they talk about the Christians turning the world upside down, and seeing the church as a really engaging in a critical way with the rest of society. And also we had a quick look at Exodus 31:1 to 6, which is about when the ark, the sanctuary, are having various things made. I think it's like when the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant and so on are all being made, and it says God fills a couple of people, and the artisans. There's a guy called Bezalel and another one called Oholiab. It says, "The Spirit, I have filled them with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and all kinds of skills to make artistic designs in gold, silver, bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, to engage in all kinds of crafts." So we shouldn't think of the Spirit of God simply in terms of kind of enabling us to have religious experiences or to pray in tongues or something like that. We can think of the Spirit of God as enabling us to do practical things in skills, art and crafts, writing, programming, bricklaying, whatever. That we can see the Spirit as enabling us to do all sorts of things in a practical way. So, right, that I think concludes what we were our take on John 16, or picking out particular bits of John 16 that we thought were interesting to discuss and go over. So hopefully that's given you a few things to think about.